Hello and good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to our first webinar of 2023. So Happy New Year to you all, and thanks for joining us. If this is your first Irish Wildlife Trust webinar, my name is Pádraig. I am the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. The Irish Wildlife Trust is a non-governmental charitable organisation that has been around since the 1970s. And our job is to raise awareness of the importance of biodiversity to our lives and for itself. And we campaign to protect biodiversity in Ireland. So this is the latest in a series of webinars that we've been holding over nearly 2 years now. So all of our past webinars are available on our YouTube channel. So please do go on there and have a look. We've had some fantastic speakers over the past couple of years on all kinds of nature-related subjects that I'm sure you'll find interesting, so do check those out. Likewise, this webinar is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. So if anybody you know would like to have seen it but missed it, you can direct them there. It'll be on the YouTube channel in the next few days. And also, if you want to support the Irish Wildlife Trust in the work that we do, please do consider joining. We are a membership-based organisation. You can go onto our website, it's iwt.ie, and you can become a member, and your membership fee supports the work that we do, and you'll also get a copy of our Irish Wildlife magazine. So it's fantastic value for money all around. Now, this evening, we have a very, what I think is it's a really fascinating topic. And this idea of rights for nature has been around for some time, but it gained a lot of attention in Ireland a few months ago when the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss recommended that Ireland change our constitution in order to recognize biodiversity and maybe even recognize the rights of nature. So tonight we're going to be talking about that. We've got some great speakers for you, and we'll be exploring what this means and what its potential is in terms of dealing with our biodiversity crisis. Just in terms of some housekeeping, before I introduce our guests, this webinar will go on for about an hour. And there will be time at the end for questions for our speakers. And you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So please do put your question into the Q&A button, and I will be looking at that later in the webinar to direct the questions to our speakers. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers in reverse order, as it were. We have Katie Holten, is an artist and an activist, and her work explores the relationships between humans and the natural world. And Katie has a book coming out, and I've seen the cover of it on your Twitter account, Katie. It looks amazing, and it's called The Language of Trees, and that's coming out in April. And we also have James Orr, and James has a background in law and town planning, and he currently works for Friends of the Earth Northern Ireland, and he has previously worked for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. So we're going to go to James first. So thank you very much, both of you, for coming and talking to us this evening. And over to you, James, in your own time.
Thanks, Pádraig, for the introduction, and to the Irish Wildlife Trust for hosting this really interesting discussion, I hope. And I'd like it to be more of a conversation than like any lectures. And it's lovely to see you again, Katie, as well. And as I say, it'd be nice to have this as more of a flowing exercise, you know, rather than like a top-down sort of lecture approach. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. I've got a few slides to show, and as I was just saying to Katie and Pádraig earlier, more to try and keep me on track and to stop any crazy tangents being developed in my head at the minute. So let me just try and do this here. So there we go. I hope you might be seeing something here now. So
so far, so good.
All right. So Let me see. All right. Okay. I think we're there now. So
That's it.
this is a very ambitious title, isn't it? Can the rights of nature, save Ireland and save the planet? And I deliberately put it there because in my mind, thinking about this over the last few years, but I guess really thinking about it since I was a kid, I don't really think there's many other games in town in order to try and resolve some of the intractable, wicked ecological problems that we face. So what I want to try and do is I want to try and say a little bit about the very rapid evolution in the last few years of the rights of nature movement. And I think it is a movement. And I think as all movements do, they move and they shift. And I think we have to be very cognizant of that, that we're dealing with ecological systems, and maybe the trick that we lost over the years is that we never, in our attempts to try and save nature or protect nature or allow it to have rights, we never really acted in the way that nature acts. It regenerates, it flourishes, it evolves, it's never static. And maybe by looking to nature as a model for campaigning or a model for action, we sort of lost something. And to me, something really interesting is happening over the last few years, which is, the nature movement is actually moving in parallel to the model that Mother Nature has given us. So I just want to say a few words about that. I guess, I'm coming from this from a particular angle. Katie will be coming at it from a particular thought process as well, or certain imaginative process. And I think all forms are legitimate. I just want to maybe emphasize over the next 15 or so minutes that, this is different from environmental protection. Environmental protection has given us a language around like nature as ecosystem services, or water and wetlands, or the oceans as blue infrastructure, nature-based solutions. I think this gives us a framework to move beyond that model, which is, in my mind, fundamentally why we haven't been able to protect the very thing that we love. I also want to try and get across in this that to me, these nature rights are also democratic rights, that in seeing humankind as interdependent with nature, that this is as much to do with affording rights to people to flourish, to evolve, to find convivial ways of living on this planet as it is with the fellow species that we voyage with. And I'll maybe come up with some questions. Again, there are no answers to this. I'm coming at this fundamentally from the perspective that the rights of nature also is not a silver bullet. This has to move, it has to shift. And the diversity of approaches and the richness that we want to share with people is so absolutely legitimate. We can't put the rights of nature in a box the way in which we've put nature and biodiversity into boxes over the last while. This is a negative slide. And I'm looking at this from, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a poet, but on the left-hand side, I'm looking at, what the scientists are telling us, that maybe we need to talk now about the ecocide. Yeah, let's not get away from the fact that we've trashed this very precious habitat. There is an author he wrote a book called Song at the Back Door, which is basically that little space that we all have, I think he calls it the infinite suggestiveness of common things, and he talks, well, I can't actually see the quote now, but it's willful to ignore the crassness with which we have treated this magnificent island. And the scientists are telling us as well, that Europe is the most ecologically depleted continent in the world, and Ireland, maybe apart from Malta, is one of the most ecologically depleted countries. And our systems and our ways of working and our legal frameworks and our thought processes, or the thought cages that we're in, simply aren't commensurate with the nature of the ecological crisis. So I think it requires us to curate a new conversation and some new ideas to try and resolve this, because clearly working with the business as usual model is not going to be sufficient to meet, what many people are talking about is the end game. We don't have much time. I want to move on to something slightly more interesting and more positive. But before I do that, I think, these basic images of Northern Ireland, to me demonstrate in a way what the problem is. We have Strangford Lough on the right, and we have a management structure there through planning or through council boundaries or parliamentary boundaries that never reflect the ecological reality of that these are living systems and connected systems. If you look at Lough Neagh, for example, to the left, this isn't a map of council boundaries, but if you look at the council boundaries there, you see these systems, these amazing wetlands, like the most dominant feature of Northern Ireland, and at least in the weather forecast is Lough Neagh. And yet we have erased the ecological reality through, half a dozen different planning authorities, several different councils. I don't think the answer is always, unitary management bodies. I think we need to reach deeper into our ecological imagination as to how we regard these special places. But to me, these images, basically inform our approach to wildlife or nature biodiversity. We're seeing these systems in very one-dimensional, very basic ways. And if we look at ownership models, for example, Lough Neagh is currently owned by the Earl of Shaftesbury. He stole or inherited it, in the 17th century. He still rakes in huge amounts of money from extractive industries, such as mining and quarrying. And we're talking about other ownership models. What the rights of nature movement has sort of suggested, in the dream time, I guess, is that maybe it's not necessarily community ownership that's going to solve these issues. It's not necessarily public ownership. Private ownership clearly hasn't worked, but maybe we need to be thinking about giving the ownership rights back to the loch itself. And this has happened recently in the United States, where Lake Erie, the local populations and local councils have granted legal personhood back to that lake itself. I'll talk about that in a wee minute. So I think these models of ownership and structures of environmental management are really locked into, not just an old-fashioned way of thinking, but a way of thinking that's based on property law. And the idea that the earth is not property, that it's not a thing, that the word environment doesn't capture the essence of ecological reality. Like, I work for Friends of the Earth, but I never ever describe myself as environmental. I don't know what the word environment means. It could be business environment, it could be natural environment. It's very one-dimensional again. It doesn't sing to my imagination. I don't imagine anything when I say the word environment, but also I think it locks us into this idea of the environment being separate. We're othering it. It's not us. We're not part of it. It's a thing that we manage. And I think certainly maybe Katie might want to touch on this as well, that within our poetic heritage and our languages, and certainly where I come from, there was a poet called James Orr, actually, the Bard of Ballycarry in the 18th century. And he was the most amazing nature poet that wrote in Ulster Scots. This is a shared language and a shared story. It's clearly within our children. It's clearly within the thinking of Indigenous people. And this very simple idea that allows us to get out of this toxic relationship that it's either or, it's either the environment or the economy. And I think the rights of nature system or ideas give us permission to think differently and allow us to go into spaces that gets us out of this toxic confrontational relationship that we've created. And we've created it, partly because of the way in which our thought processes have been developed since the Enlightenment or Judeo-Christian religion, where we are superior to Mother Earth, that we have dominion over all the creatures on the earth. But there's still pockets of ecological thinking, I think, within every country, and certainly with the artists that have been gifted to know, and some really interesting ecologists, we're now beginning to realize that it's a mycelium layer in a forest that as are more important than the actual trees themselves. And we're talking about protecting of a place like Lough Neagh or the River Faughan or the River Shannon, that it's in the edges, it's in the spaces, the liminal points where that we have to focus our intentions and our resources. So that's one source, which is, that sort of ecological imagination that's been obliterated really since the age of the Enlightenment, when Francis Bacon, the guru of philosophy, of science, or René Descartes, the guru of philosophy, basically had this negative anti-environmental position, similar to what many politicians hold today. And then the other source that I have, apart from that sort of idea of reflecting on our philosophical traditions, is the writings of a group in the States called the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. I've really been taken by this because we've been in court quite a bit, even when we won in court, trying to protect, a nature reserve or whatever, when the law was clearly on our side. The system didn't allow us to protect these special places. And when we won, the government often simply ignored what the court's decisions were. So you're in this issue or in this mindset then that this is about power and this is about money and this is about wealth, but the laws weren't working. And when I was reading what Thomas Lindsay and Mary Margle were talking about, they were saying, well, you stop one incinerator in one place, it pops up somewhere else. You stop a mine that's maybe illegal or whatever here, it can pop up somewhere, often going to the most disadvantaged communities. So they were arguing, and they basically wrapped up their law firm at that point because they didn't feel there was any fundamental shift. They were really shifting their problems to more disadvantaged communities who couldn't afford legal representation. They started, arguing that the very system of environmental law we have does not regulate the environment. It was never written to regulate the environment. It was written by the developers with this, crazy mindset, that we're separate from nature, that we have this hyper-human exceptionalism, that, we're not even part of the food chain anymore, we can carry out whatever we want to carry out, and this thing called nature will continue to evolve, which we know isn't happening. So they were saying that, these laws don't protect nature, they merely regulate the rate of its destruction. And that we've been locked into this thought cage, this what they call a box of allowable activism, where you can take a judicial review, you can have a protest, you can write your letters of objection, but fundamentally the system doesn't change. And of course, we know now that you need to do everything. The system can cope with a judicial review because it's got more expensive lawyers. It can cope with, shareholder action, infiltrating their board meetings, at their AGMs, taken to the streets, they can all deal with this stuff individually. But when you present all this, what we're learning from successful campaigning is working on multiple fronts with multiple tactics at similar times often is what dismantles their power system. But the other issue is that these systems of laws that were meant to protect nature are based on property law. So, when I look at a chainsaw cutting down an oak forest, which I did a few years ago in Lough Neagh, the company that owned the forest had more rights than the forest itself. The chainsaw had more rights in law than the forest itself. The sand barges that rip out the heart of Lough Neagh have extensive legal rights, but the actual lough itself doesn't have any rights. So this superiority of corporations and governmental systems and directors and nuclear submarines, these things all have rights, but the actual basis of what we want to protect has fundamentally no opportunity to have a voice. The question that lawyers who are interested in this ask is that, like, do trees have standing? Who will speak for the trees? So the rights of nature movement has really spawned this discussion for me. It comes from two real angles. This whole idea of separation from nature being foisted on us from the 17th century, perhaps thousands of years earlier with Judeo-Christian and other religions, and a critique, a fundamental critique of how environmental governance works, that is locked into property law. Nature is only a form of property, and the more property that you own, the more you can destroy. That's fundamentally it. So here we have something else, where, many people are starting to talk about the rights of nature to exist, flourish, regenerate, be restored, etc. So that's why I'm thinking that this is, one of the few opportunities we have at this really crucial time in our civilization to rethink the narrative about what nature is, our relationship with it. And after the two lawyers came over in 2019, not much happened. A lot of people were thinking about it. And then remarkably, out of the blue, due to some fantastic local campaigners up in Derry, Londonderry, the first Rights of Nature motion was passed in June 2021. And it didn't just recognize the rights of nature, it talked about the economy, what type of economy was needed. It suggested a participatory framework where the local communities and local businesses and environmental organizations could come together to work with the council. And at its heart was the need to develop what was called a Declaration for the Rights of Nature, based on public participation and collaboration. So that was immense. We're absolutely delighted. Obviously in Northern Ireland, the reason why local government was approached about this was because central government has been quite dysfunctional. We don't have an executive or a functioning assembly at the minute. And also there was a recognition from a lot of people in rights of nature that this really ought to come from the bottom up. That our politicians aren't leaders, they tend to be followers. And by driving this through local authorities, then we would have much more opportunity to create a movement around it. So this has been great. It's been followed by other councils. It's certainly not a silver bullet again. I could speak for hours on some of the tensions involved in these motions and how councils have reacted and how we need to breathe a wee bit of new life in it. But anyway, it for me, it was sort of the start of something very practical and significant that happened in Northern Ireland. We produced some briefings for councils and councillors about different stages in the process of how councils could recognise this, all sorts of interesting maps and models. It doesn't have to be just through planning. It could be through council-owned land. It could be through, their macro business planning frameworks, all sorts of opportunities. I think this is really important, that there isn't one pathway towards developing a rights and nature framework, either in a local government or central government, or through like constitutional change in the Irish Republic. I think this is multifaceted and can be approached from many, many different angles. So just recently, we've been looking into some opportunities that councils might have, mainly in the north. I hope this work sort of migrates into the south as well, as to whether councils can actually pass laws to protect nature, but go further to afford nature actual rights. So that work's ongoing. It's probably going to be completed in a couple of months' time. There's been some really brilliant initiatives by local councils, like one in the north, for example, where a group opposed to the predatory mining corporations from Canada and the States that have 26% of Northern Ireland covered with mining concessions. They declared that a certain area has inalienable rights to exist because it's been used by the community for at least 400 to 500 years that they know of, probably thousands and thousands of years. And the idea that a community can suddenly assert that, say, the River Shannon or wherever, or a beautiful piece of habitat has inalienable rights, brings us back to the origins of where law comes from. What is the foundation of law? Does it come from the land itself? In Brehon law, if our rulers and superiors, if they weren't able to produce, productive, healthy communities, if the cows did not produce milk, if our crops suffered, and they are suffering across the world at the minute, then central government or kings or queens or whatever lost their authority, so we're tapping into something really deep with these community declarations as well, I think. In 2 weeks' time, I think what will be the first victim impact statement on behalf of a river in relation to a waste crime that took place several years ago along the banks of the River Fawn, the SAC River, Special Air Conservation. 1.5 million tons of waste from all sorts of sources was dumped. About half of Derry gets its water supply from that river as well. So a number of groups have submitted to the court victim impact statements from the river itself, like who will speak for the trees, who will speak for the river. And I think that's the first time it's happened. Whether the court accepts or not, we don't know. But this is about a continuing evolution of laws and ideas. Literary developments, poetry, films, this is really beginning to happen now. I really salute the Irish Wildlife Trust for having this event. 5 years ago, you probably would have been locked up, to think about the idea that nature has rights, and it's beginning to, just beautifully emerge as a movement, rather than as a template that some top-down institution is developing. It's certainly captured imagination. And I think the submission that Peter Dorn and others put together in relation to the Citizens' Assembly certainly was quite influential, and maybe towards the end of this year, maybe next year, a constitutional referendum will happen. So these initiatives are happening at all sorts of layers. There's even the layer of if a council owns land or an individual owns land, can it give rights back to the land itself to exist and flourish and regenerate in perpetuity, right to the constitutional level. Of course, there's another level as well, which is states recognizing the criminal act of ecocide. Just to finish up, I just want to say a few things about maybe some of the questions that we have and these are just my questions, Interesting, when I was writing these this afternoon, there was a program on the radio, a 15-minute podcast about the rights of nature, and I just thought, like, what is going on here? This is not just serendipity. It's happening not just in Ireland, it's happening in most countries across the world. I don't have time to chat about the developments in Ecuador and Bolivia and in India and Bangladesh in terms of recognition of rivers there, or New Zealand or the States or Southeast France. Amazing things happening. I've put some resources together. I wanted to talk about those, but I think, offering questions is really important in this early stage of this very vital conversation. And the first point I would make is that the rights of nature are indivisible from the rights of people. If we accept this is not saying that, crows, and I attended that amazing crow webinar with Irish Wildlife Trust a month or two ago because I love crows. I'm not saying crows are more important or less important than human beings. That, we need a language and we need a way of expressing that, these are human rights as well as nature rights. And even that language seems a wee bit binary to me. And to do that, I think this has to be real. It can't be imposed by academia or state institutions. It has to grow from the bottom up. I think a second point is that this is fundamentally different from environmental protection. Like environmental protection is this arrogance that human beings have a right to protect an authority and lawmaking powers to protect the environment. What rights of nature is doing is recognizing that in affording how even that language, the humans can afford rights to nature, but in recognizing rather that nature has rights, we're putting the economy, humankind on a completely different level to nature as well. It's a wee bit, like emancipation of slaves, and when we consider slaves and women and whatever as property as well, we've considered nature as property. And the early emancipation legislation was you know, instead of working 7 days a week, you can work 6 days a week. If you're a slave, we'll close you. We'll, you know, it was still fundamentally accepting the fact that there's subordination and there's a huge imbalance of power and exploitation. And the rights of nature, to me, sort of balances that in a much healthier way. I think as well that, you know, a lot of the work that we would do would be working within the conventional system in terms of the third point, but we also can't abandon that. You know, it's a prefigurative approach. We're in developing what I would call a space for an alternative future. We also work within the current system. And again, that's a rejection of this binary thing. It has to be either or. You know, I think there's a much more fluid approach that maybe we can talk about, and maybe it's not time to talk about that today, but it's that idea that in looking to nature for a solution, we're looking for relationships, we're looking for interdependencies, we're looking for diversity as strength, and that has to inform how we approach this, in my opinion. And maybe as well, maybe we don't need a right to nature law. Like maybe that's just far too limiting. You know, maybe the issue here in affording rights to nature so that nature as a plaintiff in court can sue a developer if the ammonia from a chicken factory is fundamentally altering the habitat of species-rich grassland. You know, human beings acting on behalf of nature in a guardianship role need to be able to express that in court. But maybe the issue is not in the future, you know, one single rights of nature law, whatever it may be, that maybe it's about permeating the entire jurisprudence or the legal system or the planning system with this approach and this philosophy. And finally, it's like everything is about language, isn't it? It's always about language. The last time I chatted about rights of nature in the South, a woman came up to me afterwards and said, that was probably the worst talk I ever heard. She was furious. In fact, she said, this is infuriating, because we were talking about the very complex things like rights of nature from an eco-feminist perspective, or from, you know, recognizing pluriverse or whatever it was, you know, and it was it was crazy. And that was the biggest salutary lesson to me, that this is about how people express. And she actually said something really interesting. She was in her late 70s, and she said that her father didn't really talk to her, but, you know, he brought her into the field one day behind the house, and they saw a fox. And, you know, from a man who didn't speak, she said he just captured everything. He said, you see that fox trying to kill our chickens? That fox has rights too. And that's how she expressed it, you know, and I apologize. I've tried to keep this away from academic language as far as possible and all that stuff, but I think we've confused ourselves an awful lot recently, and I think it's time to open this up to people who can talk about this in a different way. Some resources here, brilliant stuff on EGNI website, Environmental Justice Network Ireland. 2 films in particular. One captures the evolution of the idea, narrated by a guy called John Spillane, the singer-songwriter, and the most recent film is looking at how the movement is developed here. There's also great resources there about the rights of nature movement across the world and where it's at. Second one, Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. A third one, these lawyers from the States, Center for, it's actually Democratic Environmental Rights, and even really interesting stuff about, you know, the potential exploitation of the solar system, not just other planets, but the moon at the minute. And honestly, again, as I said a few years ago, I had been terrified of showing this, but if you read that document, unbelievable thought processes have gone into the idea that, you know, the moon we are the moon as well, and how that needs to be protected. So finally, David Graeber, sort of anarchist philosopher guy, died a couple of years ago. It's a quote that I really like, that, you know, when people say, oh, it can't be done, you know, or you're on the wrong track, or that's not what it is, we need this solution. Let's just play with this. You know, this is a dance. This is an art form as much as a legal intervention. And he says that the history of the world is that it's something we make and can just as easily make differently. And I think that's where we're at the minute. So thanks very much. I'm sorry for talking too much as well.
Great stuff, James. Thank you very much from that. I'll hand over to you, Katie, if you have a few words to say.
I don't know how I can follow that. Thank you, James. That was beautiful. I think for me, it's about the heart. It's so simple, and I think you've covered a lot of that. And I'm not sure how I can expand in any practical way, because I see people have put in specific questions that are for you, and I don't know if that's something that we should. I've explained to the others I've been traveling all day, and I'm dealing with long COVID, so I don't have any slides or screen sharing. I'm here, I guess, representing the artists and the poets out there, working with language. I like that you ended with language, James. I think I'm actually in London, hopefully meeting with Rob McFarlane on Friday, who, if health holds up, who's working on a book about rights of nature right now, as is Robin Wall Kimmerer. So I think what you're saying about this, the movement and the momentum, and the fact that this is really what our species, throughout our history, we've always important inventions happen at the same time in different places around the world. It's just it's how we do move forward as a species, and I really think this is the time, because as you mentioned, it's the end game. We're at that point where we don't have time, really. I think there were so many beautiful things that you mentioned. I made notes, and I think, Warwick, do you want to? Because I know there are a lot of more specific questions, and I don't want
yes,
us to run out of
go
time.
to questions if you want, Katie. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had many questions myself as James was speaking, and I mean, maybe one of the questions I had was, I mean, it's fascinating to see how, as you pointed out, that this has been a grassroots movement, a ground up movement. And all the great movements in history have been thus. And I've also been very interested to see. I remember when I saw in the news, whenever it happened, that Donegal County Council had recognised the rights for nature. I mean, I have to admit, I probably laughed out loud, because the history of Donegal County Council isn't exactly, particularly nature friendly. And I mean, here in Dublin, I think it was May 2019, the Dáil declared a climate and a biodiversity emergency, and we're still waiting on the emergency response. I mean, my question maybe is that it's, these things sound great, and maybe this is a provocative question, but I mean, are these symbolic gestures by the local authorities, or do they actually mean anything? Are they moving towards something greater?
You're spot on to ask that. That's exactly the issue. Is this just the latest fad? A lot of these council environmental people, like, remember Local Agenda 21 and the Rio Earth Summit, and trying to grasp like sustainable development goals, and then the word biodiversity cropped in, and now we're throwing something at them like this, in a sense. That's how many perceive it, and so you're right to say that this could be incredibly tokenistic, but that's why it has to come from the bottom up. That's why it's not, why did the sustainable development goals not, why did all this, sustainable development language and biodiversity language and climate emergency language, and you tick the boxes of, oh, we've now got, 9 out of 11 councils in Northern Ireland declared a climate emergency. What does that mean? And of course it means nothing. These are just vacuous words and vacuous terms when we're talking about something much more significant. So it's not just words, it has to be something else. So on the one hand, I think that, and this is what the research is we're trying to look at, can we weaponize the power of councils so that an enlightened councillor or council officers can come together and says, the constitution of this council allows us to do something that can't be preempted by central government, and we'll go for it. So that could well be like powers of bylaws of councils or whatever, and that sounds almost impossible, you know, and maybe it is, but we're simply looking at opportunities. I have to say as well that I think that this is not like conventional campaigning. I think it's in the tension and it's in the rejection by, say, a central government authority says, no, council, you can't do that, or whatever, or vice versa, that it allows space for a lot of these conversations to take place. No one I know who's involved in this at the minute simply believes that a legal approach will work, or simply believes that, you know, a poetic response will work in itself, or community organizing, or people standing at the side of the River Shannon or the River Foyle and saying, no, this has to be stopped. It's like a very deep process. And some people like me operate in planning issues and legal issues, you know, so I'll go in that direction. Katie, you'll go in a different direction. You know, many other people go in a direction they feel comfortable with. But that's what a movement does, you know, it has to find its power sometime, you know. And so I'm not going to pretend, I'm not going to say that this is a silver bullet. You know, that's the danger, that people say, oh, we'll forget about all that. No, we have to build on all the good stuff that's happening elsewhere already, and we have to work within the current system too, in my opinion. But we also have to have a vision about why it doesn't work and why it's fundamentally geared towards corporations protecting their interests, and it's not geared towards protecting nature. It allows us to think through the reasons why, as I said earlier, like when you win in court to protect, you know, the air or water or soil, whatever it may be, that why is that not the solution? You know, we know it's not the solution, you know, because they'll just change the rules, you know, or else they'll fix the technical point that you won on and continue to go ahead. But so it has to be multifaceted, it has to be a multiple approach. And I guess that's my problem at the minute, you know, if you see it as something very simplistic, just a declaration for a council, no, that's the start. It's like, you know, this fundamental idea of separation from nature is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that, you know, all this stuff that's happening, all this goodwill, and that it's really heartfelt stuff, you know, it's like it's giving people I know a really considerable amount of inspiration and hope, you know, and I'm inspired by it as well. I'm the most cynical person in the world. And I think, yeah, but we have to be very clever. And once we get the declaration or the motion or the law or the biodiversity or the constitutional change and the referendum, which I think we probably will do next year, it only starts there, it doesn't end there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, to me, I think what we're also talking about is a shift in our ethics. So it's not just kind of the hard power of the court we're talking about. It's, you know, what we all see as generally right and wrong, and what's, you know, and our own personal relationship with nature. Katie, you have been an artist in this area, and I think this is an interesting area where we're seeing a response to the biodiversity emergency. We had a great program on RTE before Christmas that brought in artists and people that maybe hadn't been associated with the environmental movement before, and I thought that was a fantastic breakthrough, really, because our art is so much about who we are. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that can help in this campaign?
Yeah, I can't wait to see the show. My mum has it recorded for when I get home, finally. Yeah, I think this gets to what James was saying as well, that we need like a multi-prong, not an attack, because we don't want these violent ways of thinking about it. But the fact that it's being talked about, and I think that's why it's important you have like 131 people on this webinar tonight. And if we all go out and have conversations, I have meetings here, and every meeting I have, it's going to be a conversation. I'll bring it up, and then it multiplies. It's like the butterfly flaps her wings somewhere, and then a tsunami happens somewhere else. So we're all the little butterflies. I think that we just have to to carry this message. And so as an artist, I feel like I've been screaming about this for over 20 years, like literally in the streets screaming. Most of the time, I never, for many of those years, I never declared myself as a political artist or said that the work was political. It was something that for me, it was asking those questions maybe and trying to present something and see what the reader or the viewer, it was like a conversation, presenting something and seeing where we could go with it. And I think it was just recently, maybe the last 8 or so years, I've realized it's so much bigger than that. I think I was very naive, maybe younger, thinking I'm making artwork. It's the world is beautiful and I want to be part of that and explore it and share how beautiful the world is. But I've kind of realized that we are at this very, very, very dark place. And so my work kind of it sort of dove deeper into the conversational side of it, and where the research work that always goes into the projects that I do became these series of Sunday salons where we gathered in my home with my partner Dylan once a month on Sunday afternoons. And it became a really powerful space. It was a space to grieve, to share our fears and anxiety, all the darkness, the things that none of us want to dwell on, but the reality of what's happening. And this was back in 2014. And to be honest, that was kind of, I can't say it was life-changing for the people who joined us, but it became a really powerful space and led to a lot of projects, books from the participants came out of that. And I think it seemed to inspire other people, realize we can just do this at home and invite others. And I think we are humans. One of the things that makes us special is the language that James ended on, the fact that we communicate this way and we share this love that we have. You know, we have this beautiful world. We are an animal on it. And I think that's where I started making these tree alphabets around that time. I made the tree alphabet in 2015, and I realized only afterwards that it was directly a result, I think, of these conversations of the Sunday salons, which we subtitled Art and Activism in the Anthropocene. It was like, what are the possibilities for art and activism? What can we do in this moment where our species has affected the entire planet? As one individual, you feel completely, this goes back to me screaming in the streets, you just feel completely helpless. And I think coming together, so when I create works that bring people together, I reach out to others. I find so many people doing so many beautiful things, and I try to bring those together in new ways, like with this new book, using the tree alphabet to share stories and a lot of Indigenous voices as well. I think it's a very, very simple story that we just need to remember, right? It's about remembering who we are as an animal, as a species, and how do we live together. And I think that the heart of it is that, you said it a few times, James, the rights of nature is rights for humans, for people as well. And this was one problem that came up in conversations I've had locally, where people on the land would get kind of upset and angry and say, well, I need to deal with my reality and my family. Why give rights to that when we need rights? And so, and it's very simple. We need to sit down and have conversations. So I think that's, for me, I think this is wanting to share so much of what you said, James, and I think the pushing it from all angles. So I'll share a book and have conversations. We have the lawyers who can, I think also ecocide, the fact that they'll have that law for ecocide, that you'll have crimes against nature the way you have genocide, crimes against humanity. I think ecocide goes hand in hand really with the, yeah, sorry, it's, I don't know if you can hear, but it's hard for me to breathe.
Okay, well, we'll give you a rest to catch your breath, Katie. Now we've got a good few questions, and I'd like to go through some of the questions from people at home. And Donal raises a question that I was thinking of while you were speaking there, James, and it was about, if some countries have recognized rights for nature in their constitution, and that seems like a very broad approach, and other places have given rights to rivers or lakes, and you mentioned Lough Neagh there. Donal was particularly talking about the ocean, and giving rights to the ocean as opposed to maybe nature on land. Do you envisage that kind of approach in Ireland, where we might see particular, what you might call, ecological units being given rights, as opposed to the broader kind of definition in a constitution? Or how do you see that kind of working?
Yeah, really interesting question from Donal about, the oceans, and it's similar to a forest system, isn't it? And similar to like a river system, because, all these areas are not units. That's a patriarchal paradigm, isn't it? We can't divide these things into boxes and units and stuff. It's the connections, and it's, say, the microbial layers under the soil. It's the relationship between a river and its wetland, hinterland, relationship between oceans and rivers, where we get the productivity and we get the life, so certainly from an artistic point of view, I think, that can be beautifully explored by people like Katie. I think from a legal perspective, it's obviously a lot more complex. Communities have come together to protect the rights of rivers here and assert those rights and develop declarations with, in theory, no legal authority. How do we do that for the oceans without protecting the rivers that flow into them, or a migratory species like the salmon coming from Greenland to a river in the west of Ireland? These are very, very complex areas of law. But what it does fundamentally for me is give the opportunity for someone to represent the salmon in court, or the ocean ecosystem in court. So if a development, for example, there is a boutique equity firm in Dublin. I don't know what a boutique equity firm is, and I can't even remember the name of it, but it's a defendant as well as a local council in Florida at the minute. Now, the case isn't going terribly well for the rights of nature, but it's fascinating. So the boutique equity firm, I don't know why I keep repeating that, but it's a fascinating term, is the developer, the funder of a development in Florida. So the wetland system itself, like 5,000 houses are being proposed in Orange County, is the plaintiff in the case. Now, the government is throwing everything at it, the developers are throwing everything at it to stop this. But to me, that's the issue, that an ocean system could take a plastic polluter to court, all the way to the Supreme Court in Ireland, or for us, Supreme Court in London, or maybe international tribunals as well, to give the oceans legal standing in court to sue, or to at least try and stop this development. There was a really interesting question as well, and I haven't got the questions up at the minute, which is, why don't we just restrict the rights of corporations? And I think we have to do that as well. Like that's a corporate justice argument. And the companies that import soy from Argentinian Cerrado or rainforest in Brazil to Ireland, the biggest import in financial terms to Belfast port is soy from South America. Surely there is an opportunity to take legal action. And this is the emergent jurisprudence. These cases are happening in relation to the climate all across the world. There's, like last I heard, there was 6,000 of these really fascinating cases where people represent indigenous communities, say in South America, or the habitat themselves being trashed to feed caged chickens or pigs in Irish factory farms. Like, surely there's an opportunity there. And sometimes these laws can be created by custom by courts themselves. Like in Bangladesh, it was, I believe, the judges who actually asserted the rights of 500 rivers to have legal authority to sue companies that were polluting them or trashing them. So we don't necessarily have to, like, this is all emerging, and it's a fundamental reason why I think we need to afford these rights, because Otherwise, we're just looking at these units, we're treating nature as, we're putting it into boxes in legal terms. If there's anything I've discovered is that it doesn't work. Like we've been very litigious over the last 10 years. We've supported many cases, and yet the judge will come down, and that's why it has to go hand in hand with deconstructing our colonial and Western mindset. Yeah. This has been impregnated into our heads from our churches, our parents, our media. There was a case like last week, Irish Times reported wasteland in County Antrim in Northern Ireland has been saved by an eco warrior who's planted a tree. It was 20 acres of Sitka spruce on really good habitat, So, how on earth do you get across the ecological realities without the deconstruction of our thought processes at the same time with really important strategic policy or legal interventions? I think this is really exciting for me, because it sort of melds together. We don't give it to the lawyers, we don't give it to the scientists, we don't give it to the community, because it's about working together in very deep collaboration.
Indeed. And I mean, I think what you're talking about there is a lot of education about those things that can only really get to the heart of that kind of decolonization that you're talking about, but also the ecological knowledge that recognizes, unfarmed land as not being a wasteland or whatever. But if as is expected, the Citizens Assembly here will conclude its work in a couple of weeks, and it'll send its recommendations to the government. We know that this is going to be one of them, because they announced that there's going to be lots more. I mean, let's just say, for instance, in 12 months' time, the government does decide it's going to put this to a referendum. Well, then, I mean, despite the fact that, as you say, this is a very much evolving field of jurisprudence, we're going to have to decide on a form of words, and we're going to vote on it. And, we're going to have a debate about, the pros and cons of it. I was very interested to see the reaction from people when this was announced. Now, maybe it's my particular social media bubble, but I thought it was mostly positive, but also I was keen to see what the people who were not in favor were saying. And some of them were of course the usual, oh God, how could, it would be ridiculous, how can you give rights to a tree or a fish? But also there were people saying that, well, this could be a NIMBY's charter. This could be, just a block on every conceivable type of development. If we have to build a housing estate and a tree or two has to come down, can that tree sue the planning authority for giving it planning permission? And these are the kinds of debates I think that will be happening if we get as far as a constitutional amendment. So, I mean, how would you respond to particularly that argument about it being just kind of an objector's charter to any kind of development?
Yeah, again, it's really interesting to hear that. And like yourself, Potter, I tend to go to where the detractors are rather than the people who say, oh, this is great, this is easy, because that's deceptive simplicity in my mind. We need a lot more complexity in this thinking. And it's not about protecting necessarily the individual tree or one bat or whatever. This is about recognizing the interdependency between human well-being and the health of our species, which is interdependent with the health of flourishing ecosystems. So to me, this is about recognizing in Ireland, I think Peter Dorn is on this call, and Peter would say this more eloquently than me, that we're trying to move from an Ireland of having to an Ireland of belonging, an Ireland of property, to an Ireland of deep interconnection with our souls and our history and our future. So yeah, this is not necessarily a block on every development. Of course it can't be. We need development, we need a discussion of what sustainable development is, and we're not anti-development necessarily, we're just against crap development. I think the issue is how the spiritual and legal foundation of this country can be reimagined. To me, that's very, very important. The idea of Ecuador coming out with the rights of rainforests in Bolivia, the rights of Pachamama, that shifts perspectives. If we are to engage in this hugely difficult challenge of deconstructing our separateness from the earth and our separateness to our ecosystems in Ireland, then what better place to start than the resounding will of the Irish people talking about a new, hate the word dispensation, but you know what I mean, a new relationship with ourselves and each other and other species. This is not just symbolic stuff, this is real, because it's our thought cages and our thought processes and it's in the opinion of judges and the opinion of the mate that's holding us back in this. I would imagine Katie and Parag and myself, like we would get this stuff, we'd walk into a field and we would look at it. Some other people look at that field and see how many houses can I put on it. We'd be looking at bees and butterflies and whether there was a rich tapestry of herbs or whatever. So this shift of perception that a constitutional change and the debates around that and the community consultations and the town hall meetings are where it's at. So like, well done to the people behind us for initiating this really important conversation. Like what could be more important than discussing as a nation, who are we and how to relate to this planet and how do we get out of these crises, so these things aren't symbolic, they're deeply rooted in a need to realign our imaginations.
Absolutely, it's really fascinating stuff, and I mean, if it was to pass into our constitution, I think it would be really monumental in terms of the whole debate about our future relationship with our land and our sea. Just before we go, I didn't get a chance to get to everyone's question. A lot of them were quite specific, and I guess we kind of touched on how this might evolve over the coming years. But people asking about how they can get involved. You guys have developed this campaign in your area. I mean, how can people across the island get involved and set up their own maybe local campaigns and discussions?
So, Katie, like there is no template. Katie, is there? There is an interesting group. It's a WhatsApp group of people who are trying to keep it local, and keep it grassroots, and they come together once every 2 weeks, Katie, or 3 weeks, or whatever. And
it's the second Tuesday of every month, which is tonight, right now at 8 o'clock.
I forgot about that, and that's lovely, when people share stories and where they're at and what their councillor's doing, or recent developments, and we chat about those, and that's curated by the Gathering in Derry, which works with a lot of environmental justice organisations in the north, but there's increasing numbers of people from the south. And I guess in that transboundary issue, the foil, the air quality, the Good Friday Agreement, and with the Northern Irish Protocol, it was all about free movement of goods and services. Never looked at the free movements of migratory birds or rivers or clean air and stuff. So it is a real genuine cross-border sort of group. There is no template part. I'd be lying if I said there's a centralized campaign. There are moments coming up as well. There will be seminars and talks, and there'll be really detailed discussions over the next 12 months on various issues, I am sure, and people in this audience will be part of them. But maybe we need to think, Katie, about how this needs to be opened up. It's not that there's a lack of transparency. It's just that as an organic bottom-up movement, which it generally is, it tends to flow. It tends to not necessarily have a destination, but it just moves.
Yeah. Well, maybe
we can think about that.
You'll find it on social media.
If anybody wants to contact me, please do. And put them in touch with. Like I know more about the north, obviously, and border communities, but yeah,
there are a lot of people in Clare. I think working locally, work where you are, creating community, because then you're more powerful. It's like that when you're on your own, you have the passion and the anger and all the emotions, and you want to do something, but you feel helpless, or what do I do? So you just get together with others, and you realize there are a lot of people. Your next door neighbors, maybe.
Very good. Well, I think that might be a nice note to end our discussion on. It's been wonderful to talk to you. I mean, personally, you know, with there's so much bad news all the time around nature. It's wonderful to see this kind of movement happening and to see the enthusiasm among ordinary people, and to see that reflected in the Citizens' Assembly. It's been for me, it was, you know, a real bright spot in 2022, and very exciting to think what might happen this year or next coming out of that. So thank you very much to James and to Katie. It's been really fascinating. Thank you very much for everybody who has tuned in. Just a reminder that it has been recorded and we put it on our YouTube channel in the coming days. And also to remind you, please do consider supporting the Irish Wildlife Trust by becoming a member. We hold these webinars. We try to keep all our activities free to make them as inclusive and available as possible. But that support is greatly appreciated. So thank you once again, everybody, and good night. And we'll see you next time. So long.